Now, we're constantly told that this latest operation, this latest mowing of the grass, incidentally, for those of you who aren't aware, that's not my expression, it's not my coinage, it's the Israeli coinage. They like to call it. Every once in a while they say we have to go in and mow the grass. That's their expression, not mine. So, what happened? We're told it all started when these 3 Israeli teenagers were abducted, and then it was found later, it was said later, that they were dead. Is that how the whole thing started? It's just not true. It all started at the end of April of this past year, when the Palestinian main factions, Hamas and Fatah, they signed a unity agreement, and they formed a unity government. And this enraged Prime Minister Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu doesn't like to be ignored. He likes to be listened to. So Mr. Netanyahu had been saying Iran is a new Hitler, they're threatening a new Holocaust, but the United States and the EU ignored Mr. Netanyahu and entered into negotiations with Iran. This annoyed Mr. Netanyahu. And then this unity government was formed, and it included a terrorist organization, according to Mr. Netanyahu. And what enraged him then was that both the United States and the EU said, we're going to continue negotiating with this government. We'll have a wait-and-see approach. Well, this enraged Mr. Netanyahu even more. Why aren't they listening to me? Why don't they see these people are terrorists? Isn't it obvious that they're terrorists? Well, obviously, it's not obvious. So we're going to have to show them that Hamas is a terrorist organization. We're going to have to prove it to them. And then an opportunity dropped into Mr. Netanyahu's lap. And the opportunity was the abduction of the 3 Israeli teenagers and then their subsequent killing. Mr. Netanyahu decided, even though he almost certainly knew 2 facts. Number 1, he knew that the Hamas leadership had nothing to do with the kidnappings. And he knew, number 2, that the kids were almost certainly dead moments after they were, or killed moments after the kidnapping. But here was an opportunity. Here was an occasion that he wouldn't let pass. So, pretending to be on a rescue operation, he sent in the Israeli forces into the West Bank, where they killed between 6 and 10 Palestinians, detonated 2 homes, ransacked businesses, ransacked homes, arrested 600 Palestinians, of whom about 150 were put under administrative detention, meaning no charges, no trial. And he did everything he could to keep hitting them, keep hitting them, keep hitting them, until they finally react, until there's a violent reaction, so then he could say, you see, we told you, they're terrorists. And exactly as you might expect, exactly what was predictable, he kept hitting them until finally some factions in Gaza started to shoot projectiles. Hamas held back, it then began to escalate, and it then spun out of control, which is what exactly what Mr. Netanyahu wanted. As he said later to one member of the US administration, quote, never second guess me again, which is to say, I told you they were terrorists, And wasn't I right? But then he had a problem. The problem was he couldn't stop the projectile attacks. And if he couldn't stop the projectile attacks, he couldn't claim victory. The only way you can stop these projectile attacks is through a ground invasion. That's the only option. You cannot prevent them through aerial bombardments. But he was worried. If you launch a ground invasion, there probably will be a lot of combatant casualties. A lot of Israeli soldiers will get killed. But Israeli society does not tolerate a lot of combatant casualties. The only other option is you go in, you blast everything in sight, like during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, you blast everything in sight. That prevents combatant casualties, but the international community had signaled we're not going to accept another Cast Lead. You went too far in 2008-9, we're not going to let you repeat it. So if you remember in the first few days of this Operation Operation Protective Edge, Netanyahu held back, he held back on that ground invasion. What is he to do? But then two new gifts dropped into his lap. The first gift was the vampire Tony Blair. Tony Blair conjured this very clever ceasefire proposal. And the ceasefire proposal was, we'll have a ceasefire and we'll lift the blockade of Gaza when the security situation stabilizes in Gaza. That was the key condition. The security situation in Gaza had to stabilize. The problem was, if Israel says Hamas is a terrorist organization, which it does, the security situation in Gaza won't stabilize until Hamas either surrenders or it's defeated. So, of course, Hamas had to reject that ceasefire proposal. And the moment it rejected it and Israel accepted it, now Netanyahu had a moral alibi. He could say to the world, you see, we accept the ceasefire. Hamas rejects it. We have no choice. We have to go into Gaza. The second gift that dropped into Netanyahu's lap was the downing of the Malaysian airliner. Now, politics is about taking advantage of situations as they arise unexpectedly. For those of you who go back a ways, during the first Intifada in 1989, right as the Intifada was unfolding, and it gave Israel a very hard time, that first Intifada, exactly at that moment, the Tiananmen massacre occurs in China. And Netanyahu at the time, he gave a speech at Bar Ilan University, and he famously said, Israel's big mistake was when all the cameras were riveted on the Tiananmen massacre, we should have used that moment to carry out a mass expulsion in the West Bank. And now, with the downing of the Malaysian airliner and all the cameras now focusing on what happened, Gaza drops down to the second or third story in the news. It's Netanyahu's Tiananmen moment. He now uses that moment to go into Gaza. Now, what happened in the next couple of or 3 weeks was perfectly obvious to everyone. Israel said it had what's called, I hate the technical military jargon because it's so pathological, so sick, but they call it their bank of targets. That means in advance the places they want to target in Gaza. And they said after 2 or 3 days, we had exhausted our bank of targets. And so after 2 or 3 days, it just came to outright terror assaults on Gaza. The targeting of the schools, the targeting of the mosques, the targeting of the hospitals, the targeting of the ambulances. It was outright terror assaults on Gaza, obvious to the layperson's eye. At the beginning, even reputable human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch were very reluctant to accuse Israel of war crimes, even if the findings of these organizations showed they were committing war crimes. But then it became impossible to ignore, and the human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they start coming out with quite strong statements saying Israel is apparently committing massive war crimes in Gaza. Now, that brings me to the end, and in fact, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Because that brings me back to the United States. I'm not into, even though I'm a person of the left, I was, I am, I will be, that's my politics. I'm not into cheap rhetoric. It's just, I'm not into sloganeering. It's not my cup of tea. However, having said that, there is simply no question whatsoever that President Barack Obama was the chief enabler or the enabler-in-chief of this massacre. Now, wait. There are people who will be watching this on camera and they'll say, okay, that's just another leftist bashing Obama. So, I'm going to ask you, I have 2 more minutes, I'm going to ask you to look at the facts and decide for yourself. Every day that Israel was committing these massive atrocities in Gaza, each day that these atrocities were being committed, and as I said, after a week, they were being copiously and carefully documented by the major human rights organizations. Each day, what did Barack Obama and his spokespersons do? They just came out each day with that insipid bromide. Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to defend itself. In the face of all the human rights organizations documenting that they're targeting civilian structures, there are no Hamas militants in vicinity. All he said was, or his spokespersons, he just kept saying, Israel has the right to defend itself. Each time he said that, he was sending Israel the green light to continue the massacre. That was the message he was sending. Now, some of you might say, unfair. Did he really have any control over this lunatic state? Well, yes, it is a lunatic state, but it hasn't lost complete control of its senses. That's not true. It's a psychopathic state, and psychopaths have rational moments. So, what happened? Look yourself at the record. It's not my rhetoric. Look at the record. Israel bombs one UN school that's used as a shelter. It then hits another UN school used as a shelter. It then hits a third UN school used as a shelter. Then a fourth, and then the fifth. By the time we reach the fifth, the internal UN structure is reaching a boiling point. Ban Ki-moon, wake up. You comatose puppet of the United States, wake up. And finally, miracle of miracles, like Christ rising from the dead, Ban Ki-moon says, this is a criminal act. Can you believe it? Ban Ki-moon is now calling Israel's actions criminal. And so Obama is now isolated on the world stage. He's looking ridiculous. He's looking absurd. And so finally, when the fifth school was hit on August 3rd, when Ban Ki-moon called it criminal, and Mr. Obama realized he had even lost control of his puppet, finally the State Department called it a disgraceful act, a terrible act. And then what happened? Go back and look. The very same day that the U.S. State Department, the Obama administration said something, Netanyahu announced, it's over. The ground invasion is over, we're withdrawing. Anybody who has an ounce of gray matter upstairs, which excludes many of the people in that building, anyone who has an ounce of gray matter upstairs can see cause and effect. The moment the U.S. said, it's gone too far, you've crossed a red line, at that moment, the operation was over. So Netanyahu, even if he is a maniac, unfortunately he is, he hasn't gone completely over the cliff. He understands when you cross that red line with the United States, then you have to do what the master tells you. And it was over. I don't recommend to anyone to give their life because I've lived a very privileged existence and I don't know how I would react if faced with the prospect of liberty or death. But I have no doubt that our first moral obligation is to support those people who are willing to make the sacrifice, willing to give their life, willing to have all of that death and destruction visited on them. They refuse to be degraded. They refuse to be humiliated. They refuse to be stepped on. And they refuse to be told that they're not worth more than dead grass. So, in praise, in honor, in everything I'm capable of, to the great, wonderful people of Gaza. Thank you.